Chapter 14. Mirages. Father had 2 wagon loads of fat hogs to take to Mills, a town 28 miles to the south. So Giddle, Jake, Maddie, and Mary went along, not only to help drive the wagons, but to do some shopping as well. Mother had given the girls enough money to get dress material while they were there. It had been 2 years since they had been to town, and longer than that since they had gotten new dresses. Father, Maddie, and Mary traveled in the lead wagon, while Jake and Giddle brought the back one. It would be an exciting day. They started on their journey long before sunup, while the air was cool and fresh and the stars hung brilliant and low. But before long, daylight pushed the stars back into the morning sky. It was sure to be a hot day. However, they had brought plenty of water for themselves and knew of a place along the way where they could water the horses and hogs. They were not planning to come back that day, but would sleep at a bunkhouse that was open for anyone who needed it. The sun came up, fiery hot, scorching the prairie and everything upon it, including the 2 lone wagons filled with fat hogs. Maddie and Mary pulled their black bonnets forward as far as they could. Father and the boys pulled their straw hats low over their faces to shield themselves from the hot sun. They drank sparingly of the water they had brought along. The horses walked slower and slower, yet Father didn't push too hard in the heat. Rivers of sweat ran down their backs and their tails swished flies. Maddie knew they were more miserable than she, and she felt sorry for them. The hogs grunted and squirmed and tried to stand up, only to fall back upon their knees. Then with a flop and a sigh, they laid still, panting like dogs. By noon, Father began earnestly searching for the place where they could stop for water. The horses were heaving into the harness as though it were their dying effort, but still they plodded on. Suddenly, Mary stood up on the floorboard and announced that there were buildings ahead. Maddie looked in the direction she pointed, but saw only empty prairie, with heat waves glimmering on the horizon. "Where do you see buildings?" she asked, her tongue thick from the heat. "Over there," Mary pointed to the east. "You're seeing things," Father said, and Maddie thought it sounded as though he were suffering from the heat as well. "Oh." Mary's voice trailed off and she slowly sat down. "I thought sure there were buildings over there." She continued looking in the direction she had seen them. "I know I saw some. Sometimes it looks that way, but it's just a mirage and isn't really true," Father said. He realized they were thirsty and needed cool water and rest. "Drink more of the water now, and maybe we'll find some for the animals before too long." By now, the horses were walking as though they could not go much farther. They moved slower and slower until Maddie began to wonder if they would soon stop. Suddenly, Father stood in the wagon and looked hard to the southeast. "There it is, over there," he announced. But try as they might, the rest of them could not see anything that resembled water. "Yes, I'm sure it's a windmill," he insisted. Maddie and Mary stood up too, but could see only miles and miles of wide empty prairie. "Now you're seeing things, Father," they said. He looked long and hard before deciding they were right. He was seeing a mirage too. Would they ever find water? Then, just when they were almost in despair, they sighted buildings. This time, they were sure they were not seeing a mirage. Even the horses quickened their pace as they smelled water. Soon they were nearly running, and it did not take long to get there. The buildings were abandoned, but signs were everywhere that many people used this windmill for water. The horses drank deep and long, and the hogs pushed and jostled each other to get to the water bucket that Jake and Giddle set in the wagons for them. Mary slung her bonnet over a fence post, pushed up her sleeves, and plunged her arms into the water right next to Nellie's head. Nellie only blinked at her, and Mary laughed. "Whee!" she giggled. Then she splashed water over her sunburned face and rubbed her parched lips. "Come, Maddie," she beckoned. Maddie wasted no time in getting her bonnet untied and hung on a fence post too. Then she joined Mary at the water tank, soaking her arms and washing her face. Father and the boys threw their hats on the ground and began cooling off alongside the horses and Maddie and Mary. No one spoke, for their lips were dry and swollen, their tongues thick. They drank directly from the water spout, all they wanted. Then Father filled the water jug, and they sat in the shade of the wagon to eat the sandwiches Mother had prepared. When at last they were ready to go again, the horses seemed rested and the hogs were quiet. But as soon as the wagons began to roll, the sun again seemed to burn directly through their skin. After several hours, Maudie wiped her lips and discovered they were bleeding. She tried not to lick them, but with the sun and wind drying them so, it was hard not to. She looked at Mary and saw her lips were cracked and bleeding too. They were swollen and made her face look unnatural. Turning to look at Father, Maudie saw him glance at her out of the corners of his eyes, and she thought he was laughing at her. But his eyes were mere slits, and she couldn't be sure. Suddenly their pitiful situation struck her as being funny, and she tried not to giggle. Mary looked sharply at her, then giggled too. Father looked sideways at them through his slitted eyes, and this struck them as being hilarious. Soon they were shaking with laughter and covering their mouths with their hands, trying to keep them from cracking more. Even though they couldn't talk, at least they could laugh, or try to. Suddenly, Giddle yelled from the wagon behind them, "Get her!" Maudie, Mary, and Father turned around quickly to see Jake dive off their wagon and race after a sow that had gotten out and was running away. "Go help him, Maudie," Father shouted. Instantly, Maudie was out of the wagon and running after the wayward pig, too. It ran swiftly on its short legs, turning first one direction and then another. Soon Mary joined them, and they ran this way and that, trying to head the pig back toward the wagons, only to have her break between them at the last minute and head out to the prairie again. Jake noticed a buffalo hollow and told the girls to chase the sow into it. He picked up a weathered piece of wood and threw it at her, hitting her on the leg. She squealed and picked up speed, running toward the hollow. The girls ran as fast as they could, waving their arms and screaming wildly. Down into the hollow she went, with Jake close behind her. Just as the sow slowed to go up the other side, Jake lunged and grabbed her back leg. Kicking and squealing, she nearly loosened his hold on her. But in another second, he grabbed her with his other hand and wrestled her to the ground. Mary quickly sat on her head to keep her from getting up. Panting and heaving, Jake told Maudie to go back to the wagons and tell Father and Giddle to come. But even before she appeared at the top of the hollow, Father and Giddle were there. In only a second, they jumped down, and Father told Maudie to hold the horses. Then all together, Father and the boys pushed and pulled the errant sow to her feet and up the steep sides of the hollow to the waiting wagons. They lifted the tailgate, placed one end on the ground, and tried to make the pig walk up it into the wagon. But instead, she tried to break away, and they soon saw they might lose more pigs if they didn't get the tailgate closed. Father hurriedly put it back in place and instructed Maudie to take the other wagon and drive it down into the buffalo hollow. She was to back it up until the wagon bed was level with the ground where they were standing. Jake and Giddle pushed the sow down and sat on top of her until Maudie got the wagon into the right position. Father had removed the tailgate again and kept the other pigs from crowding too close and making a break for freedom. Jake and Giddle carefully guided the pig to the wagon. But just as she stepped onto it, Cap shifted his position, jerked the wagon, and all the pigs fell, squealing in panic. Somehow, Jake and Giddle kept the large sow under control, and Father didn't let any of the others get out, but not without shouting to Maudie to hold the wagon still. Maudie felt ashamed for not having watched Cap more closely. She carefully backed him up until the wagon bed was level with the ground again. Then she held firmly to his bridle until Jake and Giddle had the pig pushed onto the wagon and the tailgate was securely closed. How she had gotten out in the first place, they didn't know. But one thing was sure, they would watch them more closely. As they turned back toward town, they wondered if they would get to the stores before they closed. The sun was quite low, and the horses were not moving very fast. But before long, Mills was on the horizon, and they relaxed, knowing they were in plenty of time. Father left Maudie and Mary at the general store while he, Giddle, and Jake went on to the railroad to sell the hogs. As the girls stepped up onto the porch, they suddenly felt horribly dirty and out of place. But they were there now, and there was nowhere else to go, so they stepped uncertainly inside the door. 2 women were behind the counter, chattering like chipmunks. But when they saw Maddie and Mary standing there, not knowing what else to do, they hurried over to them. "Can we help you, girls?" one of them asked. Then she saw their sunburned faces and swollen lips. "Oh, you poor girls, where have you been?" she wailed. Turning to the other lady, she told her, "Quick, get the salve." Maddie and Mary felt embarrassed as the 2 women fussed over them like mother hens and rubbed their sunburned faces and lips with cool salve. It was soothing to their sore mouths, and soon they were able to smile and speak plainly. But not until the 2 women were satisfied that Maddie and Mary felt better did they offer to get the items they wanted to purchase. "We'd like some dress material," Maddie informed them. "Any particular kind?" the one lady asked. "Something dark and solid colored," Maddie said. The 2 ladies bustled about. They took several bolts of fabric from the high shelves and placed them on the counter. Maddie and Mary felt the fabrics and looked over each bolt, but couldn't decide which they wanted. Finally, Mary chose a deep wine-colored piece and told the lady to cut 5 yards from the bolt. Maddie wanted both the deep forest green and a navy blue. "But you already have a blue one. Why don't you get the green?" Mary suggested. "I guess you're right," Maddie said, "but I like that blue so well." "Then get it if that's what you want," Mary prodded her. Maddie wished things were as simple as Mary made it sound. Mary always knew exactly what she wanted, while Maddie couldn't make up her mind. The lady finished cutting and folding Mary's fabric and stood patiently waiting for Maddie to decide. "Ah, I guess I'll just take the blue." She suddenly pushed the bolt of fabric toward the lady. "Well, if you want the green too, why don't you take both?" the lady asked. "Oh, no," Maddie shook her head. "Mother only gave us enough money for one, and I think I'll be happier with the blue." So the lady cut 5 yards of the blue fabric and carefully folded it into a small, neat square. Then she took both pieces to the cash register and wrapped them in brown paper. Finally, she tied them together with a length of narrow white string. "That will be 10 yards of fabric for 30 cents a yard, which makes a total of $3, she said, as she punched the small round keys on the cash register and turned an ivory handle on the side. A long drawer slid open, and when Maddie handed the $3 bills to the lady, she laid them gently in their proper compartment. Then she closed the drawer and thanked them for their business. Maddie picked up the package, and Mary followed her to the door. The other lady hurried to hold the door for them and warned them to keep their bonnets pulled forward on the way home so the sun wouldn't hit them so directly. They smiled and thanked them. Father and the boys were nowhere in sight, so they waited on the porch until they arrived. It was a relief to have all the pigs off the back of the wagons, and the ride toward home was a quiet one. The sun had long set by the time they arrived at the bunkhouse where they would spend the night. Maddie and Mary wished for a cool bath and clean sheets, but they wouldn't complain. At least they had bunks to sleep in and wouldn't have to spend the night on the hard-packed ground with the wolves. The next morning they left before sunup and reached home soon after dinner. Never had Maddie been so glad to see their small adobe house with plenty of food, plenty of water, and relief from the hot, hot sun. Maddie's vacation did not last long. The next day, D.Y. Bontrager rode up to the house and asked for Maddie's help again. "Millie Jones is there already, but we feel we need another girl too," he said. "Millie," Maddie thought. "Oh, that will be fun." Mother turned to look at Maddie. Her face was beet red and still a bit swollen. "Do you feel you could go?" she asked. "Oh, sure," Maddie replied. "I feel all right." So Maddie packed her worn suitcase and went with D.Y. Millie was working in the kitchen when Maddie arrived and smiled with pleasure when she walked in. They always enjoyed each other's company, and Maddie was glad to have someone else to work with. "How long have you been here?" Maddie asked, after putting her suitcase and bonnet in the living room. "Since Sunday." "Have you been pretty busy?" Millie's eyebrows shot up, and she gave Maddie a sly wink. Maddie chuckled. She knew they would have plenty of work to keep both of them hopping. She rolled up her sleeves and asked for a dishpan and a paring knife. Millie reached up and took a pan from a high shelf. Then she told Maddie to look in a box underneath the cabinet for a knife. I'll peel these potatoes for you, Maddie offered and began preparing the supper. The two girls visited as good friends do, and how the time flew. It was so nice to have someone to work with, talk with, and laugh with. Suzanne, the mother, had all she could handle in caring for her family of 7 boys and 2 girls. Maddie and Millie seldom heard her scold the little ones, and it seemed as though the home ran smoothly. The children were quiet and obedient, and Suzanne was humble and sensitive. Maddie and Millie stayed most of the summer, and every day was filled with work from sun up to sundown. 2 hired boys also worked for the Bontraggers, so there was much cooking, baking, and laundry to be done, along with the gardening. But with someone like Millie to work with, every chore was easy and fun. One evening, while the 2 girls were washing the supper dishes, Millie noticed the water bucket was empty. Just to be silly, she pushed the bucket back against the wall and quipped, "Said Peter to Paul, the water is all." And to make it rhyme, Maddie countered, "Said Paul to Peter, it isn't either." The 2 burst out laughing, but then they noticed the family watching them curiously. Maddie and Millie knew they wouldn't understand the joke, and they tried to hush. But the harder they tried not to laugh, the funnier it became. When the dishes were finally finished and the kitchen clean, they skipped out the back door and ran to the outhouse. It seemed a quarter of a mile away when they were in such a hurry, but after they reached it, they felt free to laugh until they could laugh no more. Then they strolled over to some rocks, sat down, watched the stars come out, and talked until they were sure the family was asleep. The 2 hired boys slept in the living room along one wall, while Maddie and Millie slept along the other wall. So every evening the girls made sure the 2 boys were sleeping before they went to bed. It was their only way to be modest in such tight quarters. Tonight, the girls knew it was a little late when they returned to the house, but they were shocked to discover it was already past midnight. They tiptoed into the living room and slid beneath the sheets, hoping no one knew how long they had sat outside talking. Maddie and Millie planned to work for the Bontraggers until harvest, but plans changed, and all because of a toothache. One night, Maddie felt a dull pain in her teeth. She didn't know if it was one tooth hurting or 2, but they hurt badly enough that she could not fall asleep for a long time. The next morning, she told Suzanne about it, and Suzanne told her to go home if she wanted to. Maddie rubbed her cheek, not sure what to do, but the pain continued to worsen, and by late afternoon, she decided to go home. It was 30 miles to the nearest dentist, and she knew that she would not be able to go that far to pull her teeth. Father had a tooth pliers and pulled teeth for other people. He would pull hers if she asked him to. So D.Y. hitched up the buggy, and Maddie said goodbye to Millie and Suzanne and went home. The autumn air was clear and cool, a blessed relief from the hot, dry summer they had endured. But Maddie didn't notice. Her head hurt from the top of her ear to her throat. Nothing seemed as important at that moment as getting the 2 aching teeth out of her mouth. But when she told Father of her predicament, he only looked the other way. He didn't like to pull teeth. "Maybe it will feel better by morning. Why don't we wait and see?" he suggested. "Oh, no, Father," Maddie begged. "These teeth have been hurting all day." "But they often hurt worse in the evening. And maybe if you get a good night's sleep in your own bed, you'll feel better in the morning." "Well, maybe so," she finally agreed. But there was no sleep for Maddie that night. The entire side of her head raged with pain unmercifully. Never had a night seemed so long. But the next morning, Father was still reluctant to pull her teeth. He went out to the field to work, leaving Maddie to suffer throughout the entire day. But when he returned in the evening and saw her swollen cheek and bloodshot eyes, he knew that the time had come for him to do the task he so dreaded. "Go outside," he told her. Then he went into the bedroom, opened the top bureau drawer, and got out the tooth pliers. Already sweat beads were glistening on his forehead. His hand trembled when he stepped up to her and touched her chin. She opened her mouth and squeezed her eyes shut tightly. Unbidden tears trickled out. She felt him tighten his grip on the one tooth and gently tug at it. Because it had hurt so badly before, she felt no extra pain when he pulled on it now. She only wished he would hurry. He loosened the tooth as gently as possible and then began to pull in earnest. Suddenly, the pliers slipped off and hit the top of her mouth. But that didn't matter to Maudie. Nothing could be as bad as having those teeth in her mouth. Father tightened his grip again and pulled, this time succeeding in yanking the tooth out. Then he loosened the other one and quickly had both teeth lying on the ground. Maudie looked up and saw the sweat pouring off his face. His clothes looked as though he had just jumped out of the water tank. He was dripping wet. But she was smiling. In no time at all, she changed her clothes, went to bed, and slept peacefully. Pulling those teeth had been harder on Father than on Maudie. End of chapter 14.